study channel Study with Master Notes again. Hope all you are fine. So we will start Unit 11 of MEG 6 Background to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Okay, previously in all my videos I have discussed already all the sections of the Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. You can go through my discussion box and you will get all the videos of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. So another important chapter is the Huckleberry Finn in MEG 6, that is the American literature. So Unit 11, the background to adventures of Huckleberry Finn, today I will discuss. So here it is the structure, then objectives, introduction, key questions, how to study this study material, American society during 1865 to 1914, then Mark Twain, chronology of important dates, some highlights of his career, a note on Mark Twain's writings, Negro slavery in America, a historical view, Mark Twain and slavery, writing about and by African Americans before Huckleberry Finn, 1885, then American fiction, the rise of realism, then let us sum up glossary, question and further readings. So here is the objectives. So the unit has a bifocal objective, means two types of objective are there in this Huckleberry Finn. It aims to put Mark Twain's novel in the socio-cultural context of 19th century America, and it will direct your attention to some of the contradictions and questions that have been raised around the novel in the 100 years of its publication. Then here it is the introduction. I should like to begin this study of Mark Twain's adventures of Huckleberry Finn by referring to three contradictory things about the novel. These are: the novel was described by no less a writer than Hemingway as being the source of all modern American literature. Yet the book on its first publication in the US was banished from Concord Public Library as being the veriest trash, as having no reliable sense of propriety, as rough, coarse and inelegant, more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people. Then Huckleberry Finn is now an acknowledged classic that has been filmed no less than 6 times. So you can remember here it is the main point. So Huckleberry Finn already filmed around 6 times. Huckleberry Finn is now acknowledged classic that has been filmed no less than 6 times, televised and turned into a strip cartoon and an opera. Huck's journey on a raft down the Mississippi in the company of a runaway slave has become legendary. But the ending of the novel has been found wanting and has caused considerable discussion among critics, with Lionel Trilling and T.S. Eliot joining in the debate. So much so that a proof of it has been done under the title The True Adventures of Huckleberry Finn 1970 by John Shelley. In the introduction to the book, Huck tells us that one 20th century critic said that the book Huckleberry Finn was sloppily put together, and so he decided to pick up the parts, the good ones, and put together one they would like. Huck goes on to say, now that they have got their book, maybe they will leave the other one alone. The novel has long been known as an anti-racist book, with Mark Twain's sympathies lying on the side of Jim. But recently the book has been denounced as being racist because of Huck's frequent and apparently unthinking use of the word nigger for Jim. As a result, there have been demands by some African Americans that the book be withdrawn from the school curriculum. The wheel has apparently come full circle. As you see, these apparent contradictions take you right into the heart of the novel and touch upon many of the issues that have exercised in the mind of readers about it in recent times. The book is very much alive and its adventures continue. The debate for and against allowing young people free access to Huckleberry Finn has been fictionalized in Nat Hentoff in his book The Day They Come to Arrest the Book 1982 on grounds of racism, sexism and immorality. Here is the key questions. Let me formulate some of these issues. Do you think it is merely a children's book? Does it raise issues that are likely to be of interest to adults? What are they? How do you account for the immense popularity of the book? Do you find the novel's morality offensive or subversive in any way? Think of specific issues. Do you think the novel has a flawed ending? In what way? And lastly, do you think that it is a racist book? More precisely, how have Hick and Jim been represented in the novel? These are some of the questions that you could ask yourself as you read the novel, and there will no doubt be others that you will find yourself asking. Ponder each of the questions as you read the novel. We shall discuss this. This is the course of the study material. So, how to use this study material? The first thing of the course is to read the novel at least twice. The first reading will give you an overall idea of the story and of what happens there, what happens where. It is only in the second reading that characters and events start falling into place and a pattern begins to emerge. Reading the background material should come at this stage, but please feel free to adopt any other method to suit your convenience. Only remember, your prime focus should be on the text. You will be well advised to make jottings as you go along with your reading of the text or criticism. Since every novel is a product of its time, you need to place Huckleberry Finn in the socio-cultural context of the 19th century America. Then Huckleberry Finn, though published in 1885, deals with a period 40 or 50 years ago, which means that it depicts a period before the American North clashed with the South in the Civil War of 1861 to 65, fought principally over the issue of slavery and states' rights. Slavery, which is the most important focus in the novel, had been abolished almost 20 years before. In 1865, the novel was published in the US. But abolition of slavery did not mean the disappearance of attitudes that are associated with it. The text of the novel used in this study material is that given in the Cambridge University Press edition, edited by Jane Ogburn in the Cambridge Literature series published in 1995. All references to the text will be indicated by both the chapter number and the page number to facilitate reference. Then American Society during 1865 to 1914. So already I have discussed that it is a socio-cultural novel. Okay, socio-cultural novel of 1865 to 1914. That is American Society during 1865 to 1914. Between the end of the Civil War 1865 the World War I, American society witnessed several momentous changes. These were perhaps the single most important change took place as a result of massive industrialization. From a rural, agrarian, isolated republic consisting largely of farms, villages and small towns, America became in the course of 5 decades an industrialized, urbanized and continental nation, a world power that had come to terms with Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and with profound changes in its cultural values and social institutions. With industrialization came the growth of American cities. By the turn of the century, only about 1/3 of the population lived on farms. By the end of World War I, one half of the American population lived in a dozen or so cities. The country's population grew phenomenally from 31 million in 1860 to 131 million in 1940, with masses of men moving westward. The exodus reached its peak during 1862 to 1920. American emigration agents tempted Europeans with promises of free land for the taking and offered to transport them to the dollar land for as little as $35. Control over industries passed into the hands of fewer and larger companies. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, a very small number of men controlled steel, railroad, oil, and meatpacking industries without significant competition. With this came a new generation of captains of industry and masters of capital. These men were also called buccaneers and robber barons. Okay, here it is the main point. You can note down. These men are also called buccaneers and robber barons. Okay, so what is the spelling of buccaneers? Buccaneers, buccaneers and robber barons. Okay, here it is the captains of industry. There came new generation of captains of industry and masters of capital. These men were also called buccaneers and robber barons. Most of the wage earners were employed by corporations and big business houses. The massive industrialization resulted in widespread prosperity, but the prosperity was achieved at great social and psychological cost. Industrial conflicts became organized and often violent. Racial slavery had been abolished as a result of Abraham Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation, but the attitudes associated with it survived. To an extent, they still do. For details of events, books, and persons connected with slavery in the US in 19th century, please read section 6 of this unit. The post-World War America does not figure prominently in Mark Twain's novel except in The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today 1873, which he wrote in collaboration with C.D. Warner. Both Tom Sawyer 1876 and Huckleberry Finn 1885 are set in the pre-Civil War period, an era he was inclined to idealize. In both he goes back to his childhood memories, but so far as Huckleberry Finn is concerned, the question is, does this idealization apply to Twain's handling of the black-white relationship in the novel? Then come to Mark Twain. Chronology of important dates. 1835 November 30 born. 1835 on November 30 he was born on Florida, Missouri. Then 1839 the Clemens family moves to Hannibal, Missouri. 1847 Father John Marshall Clemens died. 1848 to 54 worked as printer on various Hannibal newspapers. 1855 to 57 worked as printer in St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, etc. 1857 to 61 cub pilot and pilot on Missouri steamboats. Then 1861 to 62 prospector in Nevada. Then Sam Clemens Printer's Apprentice 1850 courtesy the Mark Twain Papers, the Bancroft Library, University of California at Berkeley. Olivia L. Clemens 1885 courtesy the Mark Twain Papers, the Bancroft Library, University of California at Berkeley. Then 1862 to 64 worked as reporter and correspondent of Virginia City's Territorial Enterprise. 1864 to 66 worked as reporter and freelance writer for San Francisco newspapers and magazines. 1864 November Jim Smiley and his Jumping Frog published on Saturday Press, New York. 1866 March to August correspondent in Sandwich Islands for Sacramento Union. 1866 to 67 correspondent for San Francisco, Alta California, New York. 1867 June-November Quaker City excursion to Europe and Palestine. Then we will go 1867 to 69 miscellaneous newspaper correspondence and lecturing. Then 1869 The Innocents Abroad published. Met William Dean Howells. Then 1870 so Mark Twain married Olivia Langdon of Elmira, New York. Settled in Buffalo as editor of Express. Then 1871, moved to Hartford, Connecticut, continued lecture tours. Then 1872, Roughing It published lecture tour in England. Then 1873, The Gilded Age, a novel in collaboration with Charles Dudley Warner, second lecture tour in England. Then 1875, Sketches, New and Old. 1876, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Then 1878 to 79, extended visit to Germany, Switzerland and Italy. 1880, a tramp abroad. 1881, began investments in Page typesetting machine. 1882, The Prince and the Pauper. 1883, Life on the Mississippi. 1884 to 85, toured in a program of platform readings with George W. Cable, established Charles L. Webster and co-publishers. Then 1884 December, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn published in England. So you will remember when Adventures of Huckleberry Finn published, okay, in the year of 1884 December. Okay, so Adventures of Huckleberry Finn published in year of 1884, okay, in England. Then 1885, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn published in America by his own firm. Then 1889, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, residence in Germany, Italy and France with business trips back to the United States. Then 1894, Page typesetter pronounced a failure, Webster Company bankrupt. Then 1894, The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson novel. Okay, so you can remember in 1894 the Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson novel was published. Then 1895 to 96, lecture tour through Southern Hemisphere. Then 1896, personal recollections of Joan of Arc. Then 1896, August, favorite daughter Susie dies of meningitis. Then 1897 to 1900, residence in Vienna and London. 1897, following the equator. 1900, The Man That Corrupted Heidelberg and Other Stories. Okay, 1900, he was written The Man That Corrupted Heidelberg and Other Stories. Took house in Newark, active with Howells in anti-imperialism campaign. So when he was done anti-imperialism campaign in 1900 with Howells, active with Howells in anti-imperialism campaign. You can remember this. Then active with Howells in anti-imperialism campaign in New York. Okay, The Man That Corrupted Heidelberg and Other Stories. Took house in New York and active with Howells in anti-imperialism campaign. Then 1901, Lit D conferred by Yale University. Okay, so 1901 he was awarded by D.Lit conferred by Yale University. Okay, then 1902, LLD conferred by University of Missouri. 1903, moved with family to Italy for his wife's health. Then 1904, Olivia Langdon Clemens died in Italy. Okay, his wife Olivia Langdon Clemens died in Italy. Then 1960, What is Man? 1917, D.Lit conferred by Oxford University. 1908, took up residence at Stormfield near Reading, Connecticut. Then 1909 December, Dr. Jane died. Then 1910 April 21st, died at Stormfield, buried at Elmira. 1916 The Mysterious Stranger. Then some highlights of Mark Twain's career. For important landmarks in Mark Twain's life, please refer to chronology given above, but I should like to highlight some important facets of his career and achievements. In the best tradition of Americans, Mark Twain was many things: a printer, a riverboat, a pilot, journalist, humorist, lecturer, publisher, businessman, soldier, besides being a writer. So he was a all-round good man in all this. Mark Twain, the pen name adopted by Samuel Langhorne Clemens, is a nautical expression used by leadsmen on steamboats for a depth of water. Okay, so Mark Twain, the pen name adopted by Samuel Langhorne Clemens. So you can remember these things. Okay, so the Mark Twain, the pen name was adopted by Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Okay, so Mark Twain, the pen name carried by Samuel Langhorne Clemens, is a nautical expression used by leadsmen on steamboats for depth water. It literally means 2 marks, which means 2 fathoms or 12 feet. The 2 fathom depth is dividing line between safe and dangerous shallow water for steamboats. Okay, so here you can see the autograph of Mark Twain, that is Samuel L. Clemens. Okay, so 2 marks, it is literally means 2 marks, which means 2 fathoms or 12 feet. The 2 fathom depth is the dividing line between safe and dangerous shallow water for steamboats. Sam assumed this public persona from early 1863. Thereafter, almost all of his work appeared under the adopted name through the generally inserted Samuel L. Clemens within brackets on the title page of his books. The cover of the first edition of Huckleberry Finn, however, carries the pen name Mark Twain only. Then Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer's Comrade by Mark Twain, that is illustrated cover of the first edition of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain was more than a mere pseudonym. It was a new identity, a new image that Clemens deliberately cultivated with the help of well-placed interviews and lecture tours, magazine articles and books, and public gesture and good works. He achieved of fame, wealth, luxury, and friends of the highest circle. He also found fame's shortcomings, endless requests for money and autographs, the absence of privacy, and the loss of self to the public. This is last, most subtle demon of fame proved inescapable. When Samuel Langhorne Clemens tired of being Mark Twain, he could not destroy him. Okay, so when Samuel Langhorne Clemens tired of being Mark Twain, he could not destroy him. Mark Twain was no less a cultural phenomenon than a writer. He first attracted notice as a humorist, and his comic stage performances were an integral part of his persona, as much as what he wrote. Then he gradually changed into a distinguished writer and finally became a social philosopher. In other words, the Mark Twain persona continued to grow and change. Okay, so Mark Twain was not less than a cultural phenomenon than a writer. So already you have known this. He first attracted notice as a humorist, then comic stage performances were an integral part of his persona, was as much as what he wrote. So he was a social philosopher also, and Mark Twain persona continued to grow and change. Then Samuel Clemens wanted to be rich and famous. He wanted to replicate Artemus Ward's success as a humorist on the stage. Okay, so Samuel Clemens wanted to be rich and famous. He wanted to replicate Artemus Ward's success as a humorist on the stage. Eventually, he became one of the great speakers of the era and delivered nearly 1,000 lectures and speeches in the persona of Mark Twain. Then, the True Williams captured Mark Twain's first lecture stage fright so well that the publisher used these pictures to promote Roughing It. During his lecture tours, he came to India also in 1896 and spent 2 months here. During this period, he visited Bombay, Allahabad, Varanasi, Calcutta, among other places. Mark Twain's writing and speaking career were closely intertwined. Just as his success as a writer drove him to the platform, his lecturing helped shape him as a writer and also helped him promote his books. In 1884 to 85, he gave readings from Huckleberry Finn and other books of his. Mark Twain's writings give evidence of his awareness of an audience and the importance of the spoken word. This is particularly true of Huckleberry Finn. Okay, so what is true about Huckleberry Finn? So Mark Twain's writings give evidence of his awareness of an audience and an importance of the spoken word. Okay, so his writings was audience centered writing. Okay, so 1884 to 85 he gave readings from Huckleberry Finn and other books of his. A note on Mark Twain's writings. Mark Twain began his career as a humorist, as a writer of humorous sketches, and as a humorous public speaker. His career as a speaker has already been referred to. His retelling of a well-known tall tale, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country, first published in 1865, won him immediate recognition. Okay, so his retelling of a well-known tall tale, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country. Okay, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country, first published in 1865, won him immediate recognition. So here is the main key point. You can note down. Here is the main key point. The jumping frog of Calaveras Country. Okay. So here viewers, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country, first published in 1865, won him immediate recognition. His retelling of a well-known tall tale. Okay, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country. Then later he wrote several books of travel and adventure, which included Innocents Abroad 1869, Roughing It 1872, A Tramp Abroad 1880, Life on the Mississippi 1883, and Following the Equator 1897. Here we shall take a close look at 4 novels of his, beginning with The Gilded Age 1873. Mark Twain 1835 to 1910 was the first great American to visit India. He came in 1896 at the age of 60 as part of a round the world lecture tour. He was fascinated by the sights and sounds of India. In Following the Equator, an account of his world tour, Twain recorded his impressions. India, he said, was the cradle of human race, birthplace of human speech, mother of history, grandmother of legend, great-grandmother of tradition, the one land that all men desire to see, and having once seen by even a glimpse, would not give that glimpse for all the souls of all the rest of the globe combined. Then The Gilded Age 1873. Written in collaboration with C.D. Warner, the novel was a satire on the corruption and the obsessive greed of 19th century America. The novel began in a dinner conversation in 1872 during which Sam and his friend berated the novels their wives read for their entertainment. The wives responded by challenging the men to produce a better novel. The book, which is a combination of satire, melodrama, and sentimentality, is now chiefly remembered for its title, which gave its name to the post-Civil War period that it describes. Then The Adventures of Tom Sawyer 1876. Twain's first solo venture into the territory of fiction, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer 1876, is rooted in the memories of his childhood in Hannibal. Described by Mark Twain as a hymen to boyhood, it presents an idyllic but unsentimental picture of childhood in pre-Civil War rural America. With mischief, boys' pranks, and boy-girl romance, it combines melodramatic events like body snatching, robbery, and murder that match Tom and Huck's boys' imagination. The boys' adventures end on a triumphant note when Tom reveals in the court who the real murderer is, and when Tom and Huck discover the murderer's treasure and become rich. His next book, Huckleberry Finn 1885, takes up from where he had left in his book In a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court 1889, a scientific 19th century man finds himself in a primitive world of superstition, faith, and ignorance, symbolized by Arthurian England. Combining humor, wit, burlesque, literary parody, and satire, the novel expresses Mark Twain's dislike of the past and romance and his respect for American shrewdness and practicality. But though the novel satirizes the stupidity and superstition of Arthurian England, he does not spare his own age either. His attack on slavery is one example. Mark Twain's last novel, Bird and Head Wilson 1894, resembles Tom Sawyer 1876 and Huckleberry Finn 1885 in being set in a small Missouri town modeled on Hannibal before the Civil War. It deals with two of his favorite themes, the first of which the issue of slavery, which he explores more honestly and also most directly. The second theme is the effect of environment on the formation of character, which he studies by resorting to two completely unrelated look-alikes, slave and free babies, and the familiar plot device of the changeling. Twain's latter writing became increasingly dark and bitter. Personal misfortunes came in the form of bankruptcy following the failure of business ventures. Then came a series of bereavements in the family. These misfortunes were responsible partly at least for the dark strain of pessimism and despair in his writings. Mark Twain is one of those few writers in the world who have been great and popular both. It is an achievement for him to have narrowed down the gap between the two adjectives. He possessed a marvelous ear for the way people talk, and this gives his books an unequaled authenticity. His masterpiece Huckleberry Finn has been called the fountainhead of American colloquial prose. The Negro slavery in America. Slavery goes back to prehistoric times. As we have read in Block 1, in America, it started with the need of white settlers for cheap labor to work on plantations. This need was met by the transportation of great numbers of slaves from Africa. These persons of African origin who settled in America are now known as African Americans, and the literature produced by them is called African American literature. You will be reading the novel The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, an African American writer. The following summary is meant to help you to understand the background of slavery in America and the attitudes surrounding the institution and Mark Twain's interaction with it. The Negro slavery in the US, a historical view. Samuel Sewell, a Massachusetts jurist, was among the early humanitarians whose book The Selling of Joseph 1700 was an early appeal against slavery. His personal solution for the problem of slavery was to pay wages to his slave. George Washington 1732 to 99 wished to see the end of slavery by legislative authority, and in his will emancipated his own slaves. The most unforgettable condemnation of Negro slavery in early American literature occurs in Crevecoeur's Letters of an American Farmer 1782. He said that whites had crucified the blacks and were devouring them. Okay, so here you can remember the Crevecoeur's Letters of an American Farmer 1782 said that whites had crucified the blacks and were devouring them. Okay, Crevecoeur's Letters of an American Farmer. Then Thomas Jefferson 1743 to 1826, the author of the American Declaration of Independence of 1776, was among those who saw an inconsistency between American democracy and Negro slavery. He also foresaw the end of slavery. He inherited slaves, and although he freed 5 at his death, he also left many slaves to his descendants. descendants. During the first three decades of 19th century, an elaborate ideology developed in South in defense of slavery. Among the defenders was John C. Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, U.S. Vice President 1825 to 32, and political philosopher who referred to ancient Athens and asserted that slavery offered the firmest basis for splendid culture. Some other beliefs were the Bible nowhere condemns and throughout recognizes slavery. Man is born to subjection. The proclivity of the natural man is to domineer or to be subservient. The Constitution of the U.S. effective in 1789 permitted the abolition of foreign slave trade in 1808. Colonization seemed a significant part of anti-slavery movement in the 1820s. The Congress gave money for settling free Negroes and freed slaves to Liberia on the west coast of Africa. 1829, William Lloyd Garrison, who was only 24, started publishing The Genius. His denunciation of slave trader earned him a term in prison, and he became the first American immediatist, taking the position that although slavery could not be ended immediately, it was the moral duty of good people to act and talk as thought it should and could. He started publishing The Liberator in 1831. The journal closed in December 1865. In 1829, William Lloyd Garrison, who was only 24, started publishing The Genius. His denunciation of slave trader earned him a term in prison, and he became the first American immediatist, taking the position that although slavery could not be ended immediately, it was the moral duty of good people to act and talk as thought it should and could. He started publishing The Liberator in 1831. The journal closed in December 1865. There have been several slave rebellions. A major rebellion composed of from 60 to 80 slaves was led by Nat Turner in Virginia in August 1831, in which 57 whites died. This increased the Southern fear of emancipation doctrines. Nat Turner dictated his confession in prison in 1831. Among the numerous runaways from the slave states into the North, the most notable was Frederick Douglass, 1817 to 95, a Maryland-born mulatto who escaped to New York in 1838 and became an abolition activist. His narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, became a classic among slave narratives. He was a friend of Mark Twain's father-in-law, who was an abolitionist. So Mark Twain's father-in-law, who was an abolitionist. Under the Missouri Compromise, 1850, Missouri was admitted as a slave state, but Maine came in as a free state, thus keeping the balance between the North and South in the Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a crime not to report anyone suspected of being an escaped slave. Then, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, so you can remember the main key points here. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by a white woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Okay, so Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin to arouse public sentiments against slavery, particularly in the Northeast. The book was an immediate success, selling over 3 lakh copies in its first year. Negro slavery came to an end in USA on 18 December 1865 when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. The freeing of the slaves, however, did not mean the end of racism, thus fulfilling Alex D. Tocqueville's prophecy that the abolition of slavery would not mean the end of the Negro problem. Okay, so the freeing of the slaves, however, did not mean the end of racism, thus fulfilling Alex D. Tocqueville's prophecy that the abolition of slavery would not mean the end of the Negro problem. The reconstruction of the South following the end of the Civil War, which meant restoring its proper relationship with the Union, aimed, among other things, at assuring the newly emancipated Negro not only his freedom but his political and civil rights. The Reconstruction collapsed in 1877 with the recalling of federal troops from the south. With this came to an end any serious effort to protect the Negro in his constitutional rights. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Jim Crow is the name of the policy segregating and discriminating against blacks, especially by laws passed in the South in the late 19th century. This policy was not seriously challenged until after World War II. It was on 19 May 1954 that the US Supreme Court held that it was unconstitutional for the public schools to segregate the races. Then Mark Twain and slavery. Mark Twain grew up in a white slave holding society in which he probably heard the word nigger more often than any other term for African Americans. Born into a slave culture, Sam assimilated the belief that difference in skin color meant a difference not only in caste but in fundamental rights. In his autobiography, Mark Twain says, "In my school days, I had no aversion to slavery. I was not aware that there was anything wrong about it. No one arraigned it in my hearing." Okay, so no one arraigned it in my hearing. The local paper said nothing against it. The local pulpit taught us that God approved it. But Sam had a special affection for Uncle Daniel, a slave at his uncle's farm at Florida, Missouri. Uncle Dan was wise and tender, and it was there that I got my strong liking for his race and my appreciation of his fine qualities. His father, John Marshall Clemens, owned a slave. In 1841, he sat on a circuit court jury that sent 3 abolitionists who had ushered some slaves north to freedom to the penitentiary. He had received his greatest accolade for his unyielding attitude to slavery. Okay, so his father, John Marshall Clemens, owned a slave. In 1841, he sat on a circuit court jury that sent 3 abolitionists who had ushered some slaves north to freedom to the penitentiary. He had received his greatest accolade for his unyielding attitude to slavery. Sam's father-in-law, Jervis Langdon, on the other hand, was a noted abolitionist and a friend of Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave and a journalist and a leading abolitionist. The father-in-law played an important part in shaping up Sam's anti-slavery attitude later. Mark Twain spent every summer for 19 years from 1871 to 1889 at Elmira, New York. It was here in 1874 that he heard from the cook Mary Ann Codd, an ex-slave, the story of her separation from her husband and children at the auction block and her eventual reunion with her younger child. Mark Twain found it a shameful taste of wrong and hardship, and published it in the Atlantic Monthly. The story obviously left a lasting impression on Mark Twain's mind, for it demonstrated to him that blacks cared for their children as whites did. Quarry Farm, Elmira, New York, courtesy the Mark Twain Papers, the Bancroft Library, University of California at Berkeley. The story was to find an echo in a Connecticut Yankee and also in Huckleberry Finn chapter 23, where Huck reports Jim mourning his separation from his children. Curiously, the entry under Negroes in the American Cyclopedia stated, Negroes are comparatively insensible to pain. According to Sally Fisher Fiskin, the most important thing Mary Ann Codd taught Twain was that the vernacular, in her case the ungrammatical dialect of a woman, with no formal education could move a narrative forward dramatically and effectively. Okay, so American Encyclopedia stated Negroes are comparatively insensible to pain. According to Sally Fisher Fiskin, the most important thing Mary Ann Cott taught Twain was that the vernacular in her case, the ungrammatical dialect of a woman with no formal education, could move a narrative forward dramatically and effectively. Sally Fisher Fishkin draws attention to a letter written by Mark Twain on 24 December 1885, the year of Huckleberry Finn's publication in the US, to Dean Francis Wayland of the Yale Law School, agreeing to France the education of a promising black student, Warner T. MC Guin. The letter throws light on Mark Twain's view on racism. We have ground the manhood out of them, the blacks, and same is ours, not theirs, and we should pray for it. Mark Twain wrote an anti-lynching editorial entitled Only a Nigger in the Buffalo Express in 1869, in which he explored the subject of racism satirically using the rhetoric of bigot ironically. Here is sample: only a nigger killed by mistake, that is all. But mistakes will happen, even in the conduct of the best regulated and most high-toned mobs. And surely there is no good reason why southern gentlemen should worry themselves with useless regrets so long as only an innocent nigger is hanged or roasted or knotted to death now and then. Where are the lives of few niggers in comparison with the impetuous instincts of a proud and fiery race? Sally Fisher Fishkin, page 82. Now, but the charge that Huckleberry Finn is a racist book remains. During the 1950s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, called for Huckleberry Finn's banning from schools and libraries. Writing about and by African Americans before Huckleberry Finn, novelist David Bradley, author of the Cheneyville Incident, refers to Huckleberry Finn 1885 as the first nigger novel and holds that it was a work that prefigured the fiction of African American whether in 20th century, including his own. See Sally Fishkin. But Harriet Beecher Stowe's immensely popular Uncle Tom's Cabin 1852 came first. Okay, so writing about and by African Americans before Huckleberry Finn. So novelist David Bradley, author of the Cheneyville Incident, refers to Huckleberry Finn 1885 as the first nigger novel and holds that it was a work that prefigured the fiction of African American writers in the 20th century, including his own. But Harriet Beecher Stowe immensely popular Uncle Tom's Cabin 1852 came first. With docile Uncle Tom as the central figure, it reached the evils of slavery to a nation that needed to learn Christian humility. Recent African American scholars have, however, questioned the image of the submissive Tom as a role model for African Americans. African American literature appeared in many forms in the early 1800s. White abolitionists encouraged the writing and publication of slave narratives such as Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl 1861 by Harriet Jacobs. Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion in 1831, told his life story in prison called The Confessions of Nat Turner 1831. Frederick Douglass' narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass 1845 was an autobiography. William Will Brown's The Escape or a Leap for Freedom 1858 was the first African American play. Then and Harriet E. Wilson Our Knees or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black 1859 was the first African American novel in America. I would like you to dip into Uncle Tom's Cabin and also sample some of the others. Authorities which could be consulted are mentioned in the section and further reading. American fiction, the rise of realism. The two terms that are used to describe American prose fiction of the 19th century are the romance and the novel. Both are large hold-all terms difficult to define precisely. Writers like Cooper, Hawthorne and Melville, who wrote before the Great Divide of the Civil War 1861 to 65, have been loosely grouped under the rubric of romance writers. The romance writers were mainly preoccupied with man alone or with man and nature rather than with man in relation to society. The romance writers were mainly preoccupied with man alone or with man and nature rather than with man in relation to society. Their concerns were spiritual rather than social, personal rather than political. The result was a preference for lonely, grand, unsociable heroes and characters. In terms of form, this led to recourse to myth and symbolism and allegory. On the other hand, Mark Twain, W. D. Howells, and Henry James, who came after, produced novels that stood in a direct relation to the society in which they lived. The realistic novel of which Mark Twain was the great exemplar deals with life as it is lived. The urge to portray things as they are and as they happen is really paramount in the post-Civil War period, and this accounts for important developments in American fictional structure and prose style towards realism. However, these two categories are not exclusive. Henry James, in fact, called the disjunction between the two as a clumsy separation. It is with this commingling of romance and realism in mind that Richard Chase has used the term romance novel to describe the American fiction of the 19th century. Professor Ian calls terms for it is critical romance, and he has demonstrated that despite Hawthorne's repeated claims to be a writer of romances, 3 volumes of his fiction, namely The Scarlet Letter, The House of Seven Gables, and the Blithedale Romance, examine some of the issues of the modern world like democracy, individual freedom, the status of women, the problems and possibilities of liberal democracy as well as socialism. On the other hand, Huckleberry Finn has, according to him, a strong element of romance in it, symbolized by the raft which becomes a home and where you feel free and easy and comfortable. Of the 3 writers of novels, though Twain was the most popular, Howells was the most influential. Howells was a prolific writer, and his novels of the 1880s and 1890s were particularly realistic. As a critic, he called for literary realism that would treat ordinary Americans truthfully. He held that with his truth the book cannot be wicked and cannot be weak, and without it all graces of style and feats of invention and cunning of construction are so many superfluities of nature. The third novelist, Henry James, was a realist of inner life and believed that the literary artist should not merely hold a mirror to the surface of social life but probe the psychological and moral nature of human beings deeply. Together, these 3 novelists brought realism to maturity, perfected vernacular style, and explored the literary possibilities of presenting inner life, leaving the novel open for further experimentation in regard to themes and techniques. Then let us sum up. Any literary work must be seen both in relation to the life experience and values of its author and to the socio-cultural content of the times in which it remains firmly rooted. This is crucially important in the case of Huckleberry Finn, which deals with the sensitive issue of slavery. By the time he had come to write his novel, Mark Twain had left Hannibal and had settled at Elmira, New York, and had outgrown his slaveholding heritage. His friend William Dean Howells said that he had become the most de-Southernized Southerner that he had known. However, Twain's presentation of slavery and the language used for it have been faulted, and the book has been objected to as being racist. The adventures of Huck and Tom in the book may have come to an end, but not the adventures of the book. The background information about the author and the age provided here should help you to probe the issues raised in this unit, particularly the writer's treatment of slavery further. Another remarkable thing about Huckleberry Finn is its innovative use of dialect by semi-literate 14-year-old boy Huck as the central consciousness in the novel. Then glossary, abolitionist, one who favors abolishing the practice of Negro slavery. Then Huckleberry, 19th century slang for an inconsequential person. Originally, it is the name of a variety of deep blue edible berry native to North America. So here it is Huckleberry, or 19th century slang for an inconsequential person. Okay, inconsequential person. 19th century slang for an inconsequential person. Originally, it is the name of a variety of deep blue edible berry native to North America. Then lynching, putting a person to death for an alleged offense without a legal trial. The practice particularly prevalent in 19th century America is probably named after Col Charles Lynch, 1736 to 96. American Justice for Peace and farmer who presided over illegal self-constituted courts that held summary trials and avoided punishments to offenders without the due process of law. Lynching was given to both whites and blacks. For an attempted lynching in Huckleberry Finn, see chapters 21 and 22. Nigger, a pejorative slang term for non-white person derived from the Spanish word negro. Then tar and feathers, smear with tar and then cover with feathers as a punishment. This punishment is given to the king and the duke in chapter 33 of the novel. Then territory, here the still uncivilized frontier. Then American Civil War 1861 to 65. The war between the northern US state, usually known as Union, and the Confederate states of the South was fought between April 1861 to April 1865. The southern states had seceded from the Federal Union over the issue of slavery and the states' rights. In the war, they offered military resistance to the superior industrial strength of the North for 4 years, but the main Confederate army surrendered in April 1865. In the war, they offered military resistance to the superior industrial strength of the North for 4 years, but the main Confederate army surrendered in April 1865. The war was a kind of watershed in American history as it was in Mark Twain's life. It formally ended slavery and accelerated Western expansion. It temporarily destroyed the South's economy and estranged the South from the rest of the Union still more. Besides, it increased the interest of the rest of the country in the South. This helped to increase the popularity of Mark Twain's book set in South. Then further reading. Here it is a test. Clemens Samuel Langhorne, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Then Twain marked the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Then other books, Fishkin, Sally Fisher, Lighting Out of the Territory. Then Inch M. Thomas, Huck Finn Among the Critics. Sattlemeyer, Robert and J. Donald Crowley, its edition 100 Years of Huckleberry Finn. Okay. So here it is the unit 11. That is the background of Huckleberry Finn. Already I have discussed. So please viewers, like, share, subscribe to Study with Master Notes, and please comment in the comment box and share it with your friends. Please like, share, subscribe. Thank you viewers.